Hi, my name is Sonia and welcome to Politalks. I'm here with Linda Macquaig. She's an award-winning journalist and is a lifelong activist. Also going to be the NDP candidate in Toronto Centre in the upcoming federal election. So Linda, what's your view on mixed income housing?
Well, in general, I'm very much in favor of it. I mean, the whole idea of, bringing people together, having a more inclusive society where low income and medium income and whatever other income levels there are get mixed together is a good thing. I mean, traditionally, there was the idea that public housing would be sort of separated off, and I think that created real social isolation for people that lived in those isolated communities. And were sort of cut off from mainstream society. So I think the principle of it is excellent. I think you have to be careful how it's done because you can run into some problems. But let's just start by saying that the idea of integrating people of all incomes is a good one.
Okay. So how do you think that it would maybe change the social fabric of the neighborhood in that people would maybe have difficulty mixing in different income levels?
Well, I mean, let's put it this way. There are tendencies in society, I guess, that people often don't mix with people outside their income levels, but that's what we're trying to get away from. And I think in a place like Regent Park, one of the terrific aspects of the redevelopment are the fantastic facilities, things like the aquatic center, the playground space, I think the Daniel Spectrum building. I mean, I think that those wonderful facilities make it the kind of thing where everybody's going to want to come out and participate and take advantage of these great facilities, and that naturally brings people into contact with each other. And it's simply a question, I think, largely of getting people to come into contact with each other to see that they, in fact, have a lot in common, no matter what the income difference is.
And so how do you think that this would affect youth in the community?
Well, I mean, I think it potentially is a great thing for youth. I mean, the last thing you want for youth is to be isolated from, let's say poor youth, to be isolated from middle class youth. I mean, that just creates stigmas around poverty. It kind of prevents them from getting into the activities that middle class youth are getting into. I mean, so often in our society, money is kind of the price of admission. But I think if you can break down some of those attitudes, you can do a lot to overcome that. And so particularly, let's say, in Regent Park, where you've got as I say, the wonderful aquatic facility, that's the kind of thing little kids will, grow up playing in the pool together. So I think it's less likely that there'll be that kind of distance that there would be if they weren't living in the same community.
But how do you think that it would affect someone, say, ages 14 to 18 or something like that? Do you think that maybe, there would be a lot of social mixing in terms of just being around other people, but how do you think that you could get people who are in maybe high schools who are higher income and people who are in high schools who are lower income, given teenagers tend to split themselves, but how do you think that they could be integrated?
Yeah, I'm not going to suggest that this is the total solution to, the sort of breakdown of, class barriers in society and everything. But I think it goes a long way in that direction. I think if you come, if you're in a high school, let's say, and you're from an area that's known to be kind of a poor area, and other kids in the high school are from richer areas, as sometimes happens in lots of Toronto high schools, I think there can often be a stigma attached to people from the lower income area. So this helps to break that down. Regent Park isn't a low income area or a high or medium income area, it's a mixed area. Mm-hmm. But can I just say, I do think it's important not to imply that mixed housing is the answer to the problems of poverty. The problems of poverty and inequality go much beyond that, and you can't solve them just through putting people together. It's not just a question of everyone being together, it's a question of more fairness in society. We have become a much less equal society than we even were 30 years ago. Poverty is more entrenched, and the gap between the rich and the poor has become more entrenched. So those are the problems that we really have to deal with. Those are the underlying problems. Mixed housing is one solution to helping with the symptoms, but it doesn't deal with the root of the problem.
And so how do you think that, how do you think we could solve inequality is kind of a huge question. But
I'm glad you asked, because I've spent most of my career writing about this subject. There's a lot of different things we can do, but let's say some of the key ones are, first of all, we need a higher minimum wage. I mean, the minimum wage has gone up to $11 in Ontario, but try and live on $11 an hour. Nobody can do that. So we need higher minimum wages. It's interesting, if the minimum wage where it was like 30 years ago, if we had just kept pace with productivity gains since then, the minimum wage would be like over $20 an hour. So what's happened is the rich have pulled so far ahead, and they haven't done so because the global economy or some vague notions like that we always hear about. They've done so because we've put in policies that don't favor poor people or middle income people. They favor the rich. The whole area of taxation. So minimum wages, taxation, which has moved incredibly in the direction of favoring the rich. We used to have much more progressive rates so that high income people paid a much bigger share of their income. We've gone away from that whole concept. And also we need much stronger unions. We've eroded the kind of power of unions. Unions are an incredibly important force to allow working people to organize and press for better wages. And governments have kind of eroded their power and failed to enforce even legislation that we do have. And so, ordinary working class people have found their wage levels just, falling farther and farther behind. That is the root of the inequality problem we face, and we won't solve it simply through housing, through mixed housing programs. Those are good, and we definitely want to move more in that direction, but it's got to be part of a broader package. The other thing, of course, just in general, we need more support for the whole idea of affordable housing. It's one thing to put people in mixed income housing situations, that's great, but we need more of the subsidized units. I mean, the waiting list in Toronto just continues to grow. We've got to concentrate on higher minimum wages, more affordable housing, stronger unions, a fairer tax system. There's an awful lot of things we can do in addition to mixed income housing that'll go a long way to making this a much more equitable society.
So just in terms of social housing, I know that it's been sort of downloaded as the years have gone by down to the city level. So how do you think that the federal government would be able to take back kind of that responsibility?
Oh, the federal government could take it back so easily. It's not like the municipalities, the provinces have been trying to take that away from the federal government. What happened was, just briefly, I mean, we had a national housing program in this country that was not too bad, that had been put in place and was producing a fair bit of affordable housing, particularly in the area of co-op housing. And then starting under basically under the Liberals with Paul Martin in 1995, Paul Martin, the finance minister, and his budget with all the big cutbacks, the program got slashed and the funding was taken away. So that, that whole approach we had, which was that the federal government should be involved in developing affordable housing. You can't just leave something like that to the marketplace, because if you do, you end up with very unequal situations where the rich, their properties get more and more valuable, and you get more and more people living on the streets, for that matter. So that's the kind of thing the federal government could absolutely take over. The provinces and the municipalities have been pushing the feds to get back involved. It's the resistance on the part of the Harper government, for instance, and before that the Liberal government, that's been the problem.
Okay, I know that the NDP has a platform that actually speaks to urban strategies, so could you maybe talk about what that is?
Well, I mean, among other things, the NDP, well, as you know, I've been talking about a national housing strategy. The NDP has long advocated reinstating the national housing strategy. Right now we have a situation where co-ops that were funded originally under the national housing program, the agreements they made with the federal government years ago are expiring. So what's needed is the federal government has to come up with subsidies so that the low-income subsidized housing within the co-ops continues to get support. Otherwise, the rents of all those people will go up. It affects tens of thousands of people. So the NDP is pushing to have that funding restored. The Harper government has shown very little interest in that. So that's a situation that potentially affects many, many people and puts them in a position where a lot of those people could end up, even homeless, because they're low-income people that have, need some kind of subsidization for their rental incomes. You take that away, what do?
Yeah. I know personally, a lot of people that I know as students have a really hard time paying rent, and so how do you think that would, affect people's lives in the future, especially as there's more and more people who are being students for longer? Okay,
but let me just add again that it's part of a broader process. Like you talk about being a student, I think it's an outrage that we have taken away so much support from students. We used to subsidize students much more than we do today. University used to be affordable. I went to University of Toronto as well, and I graduated in the 1970s with no student debt. I worked in the summer and worked one day a week during the winter, and I was typical. That was enough.
Not so anymore.
I know it's not like that anymore, but I'm just saying that's the way it should be, because students are obviously in a vulnerable position, and also they have something important to contribute to society. It's in everybody's interests that students get educated, and it's in their interest, but it's also in the broader societal interest, because that will raise our overall standard of living. And if the more money individuals make, the more taxes they pay, the more affluent the society can be. So it's just crazy, this attitude of kind of, you're on your own, and what have we done? We've taken away support for students in order to give more support to rich people. That's what we've done. We've essentially transferred the money that used to support things like students, pension systems, healthcare, all those things, and instead transferred it over to the people who need it least. The very wealthy. The statistics are just absolutely dramatic that all the gains in the last 30 years have gone to the top 10%, and particularly to the top 1% and higher. Ordinary people, ordinary working people, work hard, just as hard, in fact, usually harder than they did 30 years ago, and yet their wages, their incomes haven't kept pace. The median family income, once you adjust for inflation, is in fact lower now than it was 30 years ago. It's not that we're not getting richer every year as a society. We are, but all the gains are going to the top. So that is the root of the problem that has to be addressed. And if we address that properly through the kinds of things that I'm talking about, minimum wage increases, tax reform that's more progressive, stronger unions, affordable housing, strengthening all our public programs, we could really change this society, make it far, far more equitable, and overall increase the economic growth.
I know that Toronto is more than 50% full with immigrant population. So how do you think like doing all those changes would help an immigrant who isn't necessarily a Canadian citizen?
Well, first of all, it would help immigrants because immigrants, certainly when they first arrive, tend to be concentrated in the lower income ranks. Often over generations they move up. But at the beginning, certainly, they tend to go through periods of poverty. And so the kinds of measures I'm talking about really would be, I would argue they're tremendously benefit to everyone, but they are particularly beneficial to those who are in poverty situations. I mean, if you talk about, strengthening the minimum, raising the minimum wage, who's going to benefit? Well, first of all, it's going to be the people at the bottom. But I should point out, if you raise the minimum wage, it's not just them, it has a ripple effect through society. If you raise the minimum wage, then that becomes the kind of low benchmark. And then employers are kind of obliged to sort of match those rates or raise people above those. Like if they want to attract skilled workers, then they have to pay an additional fee. And it just has the effect of pushing wages up. That's what happened in the period after the Second World War. Like there was very strong unions and minimum wage laws, and it pushed up everyone's income, and that's where we got the middle class. That's what, we didn't really have much of a middle class before then, and now we're going back to a situation where we're losing our middle class. We're becoming a society of very rich and very poor again. So I would say immigrants would benefit enormously from that.
I know that now the middle class is disappearing, and everyone in this upcoming federal election keeps talking about, we need to focus on middle class policies. But what do you think the middle class is?
Well, first of all, okay, the middle class in some ways is an aspiration people have. It's to sort of be part of society, to be in the mainstream, to be able to do the things that people want to do, have a good place to live, be able to get around, be able to go to events they want to go to, just basically have a decent standard of living. But let me just say, look, you're absolutely right. The election talk is all about the middle class. And in some ways, this worries me because, not everybody is middle class. Like sometimes people are below the middle class, or they were middle class and they've fallen back. Some people are struggling terribly to make ends meet. Those people are not middle class. And yet, if we just put our focus on the middle class, maybe we're going to forget about those people. That's why something like the minimum wage, that a lot of middle class people might not think that affects them. It doesn't directly affect them. It may affect them indirectly through that ripple effect. But I guess I'm just saying, I think it's important as much as possible to have programs that are universal, that benefit everyone. But it's important to recognize, always to keep in mind, how does this impact on the most vulnerable members of society? If you even look at, things like tax policy, they talk about sort of such and such a tax rate will benefit Canadians, but usually those Canadians don't include very low income people. So so for instance, this income splitting benefit that the tax benefit that the Conservatives are talking about now, I mean, that's just an outrage. That's only going to benefit 15% of high income Canadians. Certainly nobody gave any thought whatsoever to poor Canadians and how much they're going to benefit. They'll get no benefit whatsoever, and yet it'll cost the government billions of dollars to pay for that program. So I guess I'm just saying, always when we think of policies, when we put in place policies, how it will affect the most vulnerable citizens should be one of the top questions.
I was just turning this over to more like urban things. I know that most of Canada's population is now urban, but that's not necessarily a priority in a lot of policies. So could you maybe speak?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's really quite odd how, to the extent to which, as you say, the population is so heavily urban, but that isn't reflected in our, let's say, our federal politics, certainly. I mean, I think one reason in recent years is that Stephen Harper's Conservative base is not primarily urban. In fact, they have very little support in downtown Toronto, for instance. Their support is in the rural areas, you know, I'll just leave it at that. It's in the rural areas. And not exclusively, obviously. They also have huge support on Bay Street, for instance. But this lack of, you know, so much of the conservative policy, so many of the conservative policies are really aimed at serving their base, you know, the 35% of Canadians that can be counted on to vote Conservative. So if you have a government that's so focused on that, on serving that base, they neglect the rest of the country. I mean, they neglect people that are living in cities, which is the majority of the country.
Yeah, well, this just sort of reminds me of the Canada Post issue.
Yes.
Making the super mailboxes. Well, I was thinking that doesn't really affect anybody who's rural, which is where most of Stephen Harper's base comes from, but that would really strongly affect people who are urban, and that's not necessarily always the safest option to have your things that are being shipped to you down the street or
yeah.
You know.
Oh, well, the whole thing about the post office just gets me enraged simply because there's no reason to have to be cutting back postal service like that. The post office is in fact overall a profitable operation, and it could be way more profitable if they acted on suggestions, for instance, to allow the post office to introduce postal banking, so that you know, people could do their banking through the post office, which when you think about it is a terrific idea. They have that in other countries. And so what that means is that, you know, first of all, so many people in downtown Toronto, for instance, don't even have access to a bank. The banks are increasingly disappearing, you know, their corner branches. And so more and more people, and this is of course true in the rural areas too, but more and more people rely on, you know, those kind of quick cash, you know, payday loan kind of things, which are just rip-offs, you know. So I'm just saying, there's a perfect example of how we could introduce a new service that would benefit, primarily have a huge benefit to people at the lower income level, and keep our post office vibrant and financially secure. But no, instead the Conservatives government is to cut services to people who want those services.
I know I personally, I'm at the bank in the other side of the country and it's not here.
Yeah.
So every time I go to the bank I get charged, you know, $2, $3, and that really adds up. So.
Oh, it does. You know, it's so interesting because the post office has more outlets across the country than all the banks put together. So if you had postal banking, this is one of my pet issues, if you had it, you'd be able to access, through any post office, you could access your bank account, you know? Yeah. And that would be a great service. And the post office wouldn't be charging you outrageous rates of interest the way those unregulated payday loan services are. They could charge you a fair rate of interest, if you know, charge you a fair rate and still make a profit. And that could help support the post. It's a win-win situation, except for everyone except the banks.
Yeah, which can be the problem.
Yeah,
I guess.
yeah.
Just thinking about, you were talking about these payday loan sharks and everything. Just thinking about urban communities and stuff like that. How do you think that like an access to services would really affect people in different areas?
Yeah, I mean, you know what's interesting is that when we were talking about the banks closing branches, they don't close them in the rich areas. In fact, amazingly, I saw the other day in Rosedale, they've added new branches. You know, there's a corner in Rosedale, or an area in Rosedale, where there's something like 3 major banks with branches right on one street corner. Meanwhile, the rest of the city, certainly the depressed parts of the city, we're seeing fewer and fewer branches. And that's a very serious thing, because what that ends up meaning is that often low-income people, you know, don't have a car, can't afford to get around, or disabled, they have difficulty going on the TTC. And so they end up doing their banking, well, you know, with loan sharks and people like that. So something like, I mean, you know, this raises all kinds of issues, like making the TTC more affordable and that sort of thing. And it comes back to mixed income housing as well, that the more we can create communities that aren't just, you know, places that are concentrated places for poor people, and that those people then become sort of prey to loan sharks and everything, the better urban community we're going to have.
And how do you think that through kind of more like community agencies and stuff like that, we'd be able to make community? Do you think that's more the responsibility of not-for-profit kind of groups, or do you think that would be more the responsibility of governments, just municipally or federally,
to create more,
to have more institutions that like encourage building community?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a combination. I certainly think you want all kinds of community grassroots groups that are totally come out of the community themselves, you know, come out of the community itself, and it draws on the local people. But there is a huge, huge role for government at all levels to do things to make people's lives better. I mean, in the last few decades, we've gotten away from this idea that governments can do things for people. I mean, the idea now is government is bad, anything government does we want less of. That is nonsense, and that whole agenda has been very favorable to the rich, because they don't necessarily need a lot of programs. They like to buy their own health care and their own education at private schools and whatever, you know, all the community services, pensions and things that people rely on. You know, they don't need the aquatic center because they've got backyard swimming pools, or they belong to private clubs. But when you allow your public system, your swimming pools and skating rinks and things like that, when you cut back those kinds of services in the name that we can't afford them, which is ridiculous, it's ordinary people that suffer. And the lower down the income scale, the bigger the suffering is, because the less access they have to alternatives. So I guess I just want to make a general point that we need active government. We need government on our side, not just government that fights wars, which we should be fighting less of, but government that actually engages in the community and provides services that we really want, that Canadians really want, and that we really need, and that we can afford. That's the key thing. We can afford these things. We are richer now than we were 30 years ago. By about, our GDP has grown by about 150% per capita. And yet suddenly we say, oh, well, we can't afford skating rinks after February, or we can't have swimming pools after August. Why? Of course we can afford these things, but it's a question of getting our priorities right.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Linda.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
All right, well, I'm Sonia, and this has been Politalks.